welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The storm had been prowling over London all afternoon, restless and resentful, until by evening it began to strike in earnest. Rain lashed the soot-stained rooftops, rattled the blackout shutters, and sent rivulets streaming down the lamplight-starved pavements. From the window of their modest flat in South Kensington, Tuppence Beresford pressed back the curtain for a quick glance outside. The glass quivered in its frame under another booming crack of thunder, and for a moment the flash revealed a street emptied of all but the solitary figure of the warden at his post, oilskin glistening as he tugged the strap of his helmet tighter against the gale. Inside, the fire fought bravely in the grate, giving the sitting room a pocket of warmth against the night. Tommy sat at the table, shoulders hunched, his hair damp and flattened from his dash to fetch the evening post. Before him lay a single envelope, a cheap nondescript thing, ivory cold, but already warped from the rain. He had slit it open, read the contents, and now stared at the single sheet as though it might suddenly rearrange itself into something more sensible. Tuppence let the curtain fall back with a snap. "You look," she said, "as if you've seen one of Mr. Churchill's speeches written backward." Tommy did not smile. "I wish it were that harmless." He tapped the letter with his forefinger. "Have a look." She crossed to him, the hem of her skirt brushing the worn rug, and picked up the page. The typewritten words were stark in their brevity. From Churchill's own desk it was taken. "A traitor sits in the cabinet. Beware whom you trust." No signature, no address, only that warning. The ink had blurred slightly where a raindrop had struck it, but the message remained chillingly clear. Tuppence raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's succinct, almost polite for treason." She lowered herself into the chair opposite. "Do we suppose this is some crank's idea of amusement? Or ought we to be quaking in our sensible shoes?" "I don't believe it's a crank," Tommy said slowly. "The envelope was pushed directly through our letterbox. No postmark, no stamp. Someone delivered it by hand." The rain hammered the window again, as though to underline his point. For a moment the room seemed to shrink with the weight of secrecy. Tuppence gave a low whistle, and of all the letterboxes in London, it chose ours. "Not chance," Tommy muttered. "We've worked for intelligence before. Someone must have remembered." She tilted her head, watching him. Tommy Beresford had never entirely shed the stiff-backed soldierly air of his war days, though he wore it now over a frame slightly softened by domestic comfort. His eyes tonight, however, were sharp and troubled. "Darling," she said, aiming for brightness, "we have been out of the cloak and dagger business for some time. Unless, of course, you've been sneaking about while I wasn't looking, cultivating spies behind my back." That one, a thin smile. "No, but this," he pushed the letter toward her again. "It refers to Churchill directly. That's not the sort of name one band about lightly. If a document has truly been stolen from his desk, then someone is playing for very high stakes indeed," she finished. The fire hissed as a drop of rain found its way down the chimney. For a moment, neither spoke. The air-raided siren had not yet wailed, but the silence outside seemed to carry its own menace. Tuppence folded the letter and set it neatly back on the table. "Let's examine this with cool heads, shall we? First, possibility. It's nonsense designed to rattle. Second, it's genuine but exaggerated. Third, it is exactly what it claims to be, in which case we are sitting on top of a keg of dynamite." Tommy rubbed his temple. "And in all three possibilities, we cannot simply burn it and forget." "Precisely," Shell leaned back, "considering if it is nonsense, Whitehall will want to know who is spreading such tales. If it is genuine, Well, better us to stumble on it than the enemy. And if it is dynamite, she smiled faintly, then at least we're not likely to be bored. Her levity was thinner than usual, but it steadied him. You think we should investigate before reporting? He asked. Investigate discreetly, she corrected. The fewer people know, the better. Besides, if there truly is a traitor in the cabinet, one does not toss a letter onto the nearest minister's desk and hope for the best. We may be amateurs, darling, but we're not complete fools. August banged against the shutter, making them both jump. Tuppence rose and crossed to secure the latch. The shadows of raindrops streaked across her face as she returned. Suppose it is real, Tommy said slowly. Suppose there is a traitor, and suppose that document has been stolen. What document would be left unguarded on the Prime Minister's desk? Something urgent, perhaps, Tuppence mused. Something he meant to carry into meeting or to mark before bed. Plans, figures, code names, whatever it was, it would not be trivial. Tommy sighed. I had hoped we were done with this sort of thing. She reached across the table, laying her hand lightly on his ode. You didn't really believe it. That made him chuckle woefully. You know me too well. A sudden glare washed the room for a heartbeat, the windows shivering in their frames. For a second, the letter gleamed between them like a strip of phosphorescence. Then darkness and thunder reclaimed it. Tuppence drew her hand back. We'll need to be clever about this. Whoever slipped that through the box did so because they trusted you, sir, because they were too afraid to go elsewhere. Either way, it means we'll have to tread very carefully. Tommy stood, stretching his shoulders as though reading for duty once more. Then it settled. We dig discreetly. No names, no rash reporting. We'll see what we can learn first. She gave a decisive nod. Good. And we start tomorrow. Tonight we may as well try to sleep. Though I doubt either of us will manage much with the storm rattling like a burglar at the windows. He folded the letter again, slipped it back into its envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket. The motion was almost ceremonial, as though accepting a commission. The fire had burned low. Shadows filled the corners of the room, like conspirators whispering among themselves. Tuppence, ever practical, fetched a blanket and draped it around her shoulders before sitting again. You know, Tommy, she said, her voice quieter now, what strikes me most is not that someone may have stolen from Churchill. It's that someone else risked everything to tell us. That sort of courage or desperation is rarely wasted. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Let's hope you're right. The storm bellowed, rattling the very bones of the building. For a long time they sat in silence, side by side, two figures against the dark, while the city held its breath. Outside, the river rolled its black waters toward the sea, carrying secrets with it, and in their pocket lay a letter no one should have seen. A letter that would lead them into danger neither yet imagined. London had the look of a city perpetually hunched against both weather and war. The morning after the storm, the streets around St. James's glistened with damp, their cobblestones reflecting the grey wash of the sky. Buses crawled under blackout-painted roofs. Clerks hurried along with collars turned up, and everywhere lingered the faint smell of last night's smoke, as though the city itself had taken to chain smoking against its nerves. Tommy and Tuppence walked side by side, their pace brisk but unhurried, careful not to seem like a pair with a secret. It was Tommy who kept glancing over his shoulder, but Tuppence who noticed more. Her eyes, sharp behind their modest brim, marked the sweep of pedestrians, the uniforms at the crossings, the polished shoes of men who might be military, or might only wish to look at. Darling, she murmured, if you turn around once more, people will think you've lost a coin in the gutter and can't bear to part with it. Tommy gave a sheepish grin. Old habit. It's not old, she corrected. It's brand new and most suspicious. Do stop it. Their destination stood tucked between a tobacco shop and a discreet tailor, a narrow tea room with a faded awning, and a sign so modest one could pass it thrice without noting. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled aromas of strong tea, damp coats, and the faintly metallic scent of ration tins. The tables were set with chipped crockery, the sugar served in careful cubes, 2 per patron, no exceptions. Harding was already there. He looked younger than they had expected, scarcely past 25, with the pale, hollow-cheeked face of one who spent his days under gaslight rather than sun. His fingers drummed on the table until he saw them approach. Then he straightened, forcing a nervous smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford." His voice quavered on the second syllable. "Yes," said Tommy, sliding into the seat opposite. Tuppence followed, laying her gloves neatly beside her plate, as though they had come for nothing more alarming than crumpets. Harding leaned forward a tons, his words tumbling over one another. "I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't, but you must know. You must be told. I saw it with my own eyes, the Prime Minister's desk, the drawer, rifled." His breath caught, and he darted a glance toward the table by the window, where 2 officers sat in quiet conversation. Tuppence poured tea with deliberate calm. "Do take a breath, Mr. Harding. Start at the beginning. What exactly did you see?" "I work in the cabinet offices," he whispered. "Junior clerk, night shift sometimes, sorting dispatches. A week ago I was sent late with papers. The corridor was empty. It always is at that hour. But I heard something in the Prime Minister's study. I thought perhaps he had returned. Only he swallowed. It wasn't him. A man was there, bent over the desk, pulling out papers." Tommy's eyes sharpened. "Could you identify him?" Harding shook his head miserably. The light was low. "I only saw a figure in a dark suit. He heard me. I fled before he could turn, but afterward his hand slipped into his coat pocket. I found this on the floor." He drew out a folded scrap of paper and laid it on the table. Tuppence unfolded it carefully. It was half of a memorandum, the torn edge jagged. The words typed upon it were fragmentary, but clear enough. "Hammerfall, deployment figures withheld until approval." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a glance. The word itself crackled with menace. "Where is the other half?" Tuppence asked. "I don't know." Harding's hands trembled as he reached for his teacup, only to set it down untouched. "I feared to keep even this if they knew I had it." He broke off, his gaze darting again to the window. "We shouldn't be speaking here." Tommy tried for reassurance. "You did right to come to us, but you must tell us more. Did you see anything? A ring? A limp? Any clue at all?" Harding shook his head violently. "Nothing. I've already said too much." At that moment, Tuppence noticed a man outside the window. He wore a bowler hat pulled low and carried a folded newspaper under his arm. He stood as though waiting, but his eyes, sharp darting, flicked toward their table before sliding away again. "Tommy," she murmured, "we have an admirer." Harding went white. "He's followed me since this morning. I knew it. I knew I was watched." He pushed back his chair suddenly, nearly upsetting the table. "I can't stay. If they see me with you, Mr. Harding," Tommy began. But the clerk was already on his feet, fumbling for coins, leaving them scattered on the saucer. "I'll send word," Harding stammered. "Somehow, but I must go." Before either Beresford could rise, he slipped through the door, the bell jangling faintly behind him. Tommy half stood, but Tuppence's hand on his sleeve stopped him. "Wait," she said softly. "Not here, not now." The suspicious man in the bowler hat had already moved, blending into the thin midday crowd outside. He lit a cigarette with careful nonulance, but his gaze tracked Harding's retreating figure. The tea room resumed its hum, teaspoons clinking, officers murmuring. To any observer, nothing had happened at all, yet the Beresford sat in silence for a long moment, the torn memorandum between them like contraband. "Well," Tommy said finally, "that went swimmingly." Tuppence gave a dry smile. "We came for answers and have only half a paper and half a story. But we also have proof that Harding saw something. People don't tremble like that over shadows." She folded the memorandum piece and slipped it into her handbag. "What worries me," she added, "is not Harding's nerves. It's that someone else seems very interested in his movements." They paid, stepped out into the grey drizzle, and scanned the street. Harding was already gone, swallowed by the fog that drifted in from the river. The man in the bowler hat stubbed out his cigarette and walked briskly in the opposite direction. Whether he was spy, chauffeur, or something else entirely remained uncertain. They would see the bowler again, always at a distance, always just before the next turn. Tuppence tightened her coat against the chill. So she said, "Our Mr. Harding has vanished like a puff of smoke. What do you suppose we should do next?" Tommy's expression hardened. "Find him before whoever's following does." They set off down the street, their footsteps quickening. The fog closed in, muffling, the rumble of buses dimming the lamps. Ahead, a thin silhouette disappeared around a corner. For an instant, Tuppence thought it was Harding. But when they turned after him, the street lay empty. Only the mist lingered, thick and impenetrable, hiding secrets as carefully as any cabinet drawer. And somewhere within it, a frightened clerk had slipped from their grasp. Fog had clung to the city through the night, and by morning it still lingered in pockets, pale wisps curling about the lampposts, drifting over Bloomsbury squares and sliding into the doorways of tall lodging-houses. It was to one of these that Tommy and Tuppence came, their collars turned up, and their mood a mixture of urgency and unease. The address had been prized from a ministry directory after Tommy's discreet inquiries. Nothing official, only a whispered confirmation that Harding Junior Clerk rented a room in Hunter Street. They had taken the number, written it down as though it were only for a milk delivery, and set out at once. The lodging house was of the tall, narrow type, a row of brown brick with peeling paintwork, its front steps worn hollow from decades of tenants coming and going. Curtains sagged in the lower windows, and the brass knocker on the front door had tarnished to a dull green. Tuppence gave the knocker a brisk rap. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman of middle years with a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, watery and suspicious, flitted from Tommy to Tuppence. "Yes, we're here to see Mr. Harding," Tommy said pleasantly. At once, the woman's expression pinched. "Mr. Harding isn't in. When do you expect him?" Tuppence asked. The landlord pressed her lips tight, as if every word were coin paid from her own purse. "Can't say. He left in a hurry yesterday, packed some things, said he was going north." Something in her tone rang false. Tuppence caught the hesitation, the almost imperceptible stumble before packed. She exchanged a quick glance with Tommy, then smiled with all her most disarming charm. "Well, just wait for him then, if you don't mind." The woman fidgeted. "Well, his room's not let to you." "Quite right," said Tuppence. "But if you'll allow us a peep purely to leave a note, it would be ever so kind." The landlady dithered, finally muttering, "Suit yourselves. Top floor, last door left." The staircase creaked under their tread. The air smelled faintly of damp and boiled cabbage, that universal perfume of London lodging-houses. On the landing, a single gas lamp flickered, throwing yellow shadows that seemed to twitch as they moved. They reached Harding's door and pushed it open. The room was chaos, drawers yanked out. Their contents spilled, a teacup shattered on the hearthrug, the bedclothes half torn from the mattress. On the desk, an overturned lamp, its shade dented. The grate still smouldered faintly, a curl of smoke rising from blackened scraps. Tuppence inhaled, the acrid tang of burnt paper still lingered. "Yes, Dwight, it do too." "Well," she said softly, "if Mr. Harding packed for the north. He packed like a burglar chased him. Tommy crossed to the grate crouching. With the poker, he prodded at the charred fragments, coaxing out one or two that had not been wholly consumed. On the corner of one, faintly visible, was a string of typed numbers. Another bore the beginning of a word au pair before thich gave way to ash. "Looks like notes," Tommy muttered. "Coded, perhaps. Someone wanted them gone. Or Harding himself destroyed them," Terence counted. Tommy rose, dusting his hands. Then why leave the rest of the room like this? No, someone else was here. She stepped carefully through the wreckage, eyes narrowed, until something caught her attention beneath the bed. She bent, drew it out and held it up, a railway ticket stub, crumpled but legible. King's Cross to York. She read yesterday's date. Tommy took it, frowning. That supports the landlady's tale. Harding might have fled north after all. Or, said Tuppence crisply, it was left there for us to find. Very convenient, don't you think? And men who drown in the Thames seldom change trains at York. She added dryly. Their argument began at once, quiet but sharp. Tommy, practical, inclined toward Harding's cowardice. He was nervous, shaking like a leaf. He might have imagined himself pursued, panicked and run, perfectly natural for a frightened clerk out of his depth. Tuppence shook her head. And leave half his notes to burn. No, he knew too much. Someone got to him. I'll wager he never made it as far as York. They paused as the landlady's heavy tread creaked up the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, hands clasped together, face pale. You've seen, then? Yes, Tuppence said gently. Did you hear anything last night? The woman's gaze darted left, right, anywhere but their eyes. No, nothing, and I don't want trouble. Tenants come and go. It's not my affair, but surely, Tommy began. She shook her head fiercely. Not my affair, I said. Don't ask me more. Her fear was plain. She looked like a bird ready to fly. With a quick bow of her head, she turned and hurried away, her skirts brushing the wall. The Beresfords stood in silence for a long moment, listening to her retreating footsteps. Well, Tuppence said, that was about as informative as a broken wireless. Tommy glanced again at the ticket stub. If Harding truly went north, we must find him. If not, he left the rest unsaid. Tuppence surveyed the room once more. Her instincts prickled at the silence, at the scent of burnt paper, at the odd sense of a presence hurriedly effaced. Whichever it is, she said firmly, we can't do it together. Too many threads to chase. You've Whitehall connections. Go prod them. See if anyone knows more of this Hammerful business. I'll work on the human angle. Lodging housemaids and errand boys often see what their betters do not. He looked reluctant. Splitting up isn't wise. It's efficient, she counted, with that practical glint in her eye that always overruled his caution. Besides, if someone is watching, it's best they not see us as a pair. Divide and conquer. He sighed. You're determined. As always, she offered her hand, and he clasped it briefly, the grip conveying more than words. Then they descended the stairs past the flickering lamp, out into the fog-cloaked street. At the corner they paused, agreed on a time to meet, and set off in opposite directions. The mist swallowed them at once, each into a different world of questions and shadows. Somewhere within it, the truth about Harding, coward or corpse, lay waiting. And for the first time, they walked separately toward danger. Whitehall had a way of swallowing sound, even in the busiest hours. Tommy Beresford knew it well. The echoing stone corridors, the ceaseless shuffle of boots, the clipped heels of women in uniform, hurrying with files tucked under their arms. The war had turned the great government offices into a hive, yet a hive with secrets behind every door. He walked briskly, his hat in hand, his expression composed, but his thoughts uneasy. It had been years since he had last moved with purpose through these halls. Then he had been young, untested, clumsy with nerves. Now older and tempered by years of both war and peace, he felt none of the old thrill. What pressed against him instead was the weight of responsibility. That letter slipped under his door. Harding's terror, and the sense that something far larger than himself was stirring in the shadows of government. The cabinet corridor stretched ahead, its marble floor polished to a reflective sheen. Tall windows on one side were shaded against the grey light. On the other, doors lined up in solemn order, each hiding a ministry office humming with war work. Clerks hurried past, their arms laden with files tied in string, while officers and khaki strode with determined purpose. Yet, despite the bustle, Tommy felt the hush, the guarded air that came when lives and battles depended upon words written on paper. He found Major Blackwood waiting in air cess near a tall statue of Pitt the Younger. The Major looked much as Tommy remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, a heavy moustache bristling like bayonets. His uniform was immaculate, the Sam Brown belt gleaming, and his eyes, sharp as ever, missed nothing in the crowd. "Beresford," Blackwood said in greeting, his voice a low growl meant not to carry. "So, you've come back into the game after all." Tommy managed a thin smile. "It seems the game found me first." They shook hands briefly. Blackwood's grip was firm, though his glance flickered down the corridor before he leaned closer. "You wanted to know about Churchill's desk," Blackwood said quietly. "Steeden, and he is the dangerous subject, my boy." "Very dangerous, but I'll tell you what I can." They moved a few steps along, away from the stream of clerks, until they stood half hidden in the alcove of a doorway. The hush there was more profound, though the air smelled of dust and polish. Blackwood spoke in measured tones. "The Prime Minister's study is not sacred ground. Several men have access, not casually, mind you, but by necessity, cabinet papers, strategy notes, dispatches from abroad. After hours, when Mr. Churchill himself is away, there are only a handful who might enter." Tommy waited, his nerves taut. Blackwood continued. "3 names you should know. But mark me, I'm not accusing. To accuse is political dynamite, and I will not light the fuse. Still, if you're sniffing about, you'd best know the ground you tread." He raised a gloved hand, counting off on his fingers. First, Sir Reginald Petton, a charmer smooth as butter, old family, old debts, plays the host of half of London society, though heaven knows how he pays for the champagne. A man like that could be leaned on. Tommy pictured the type. Tailored suits, a smile in every drawing room, but creditors at every door. He nodded. Second, Lord Ainsworth, hawkish, ambitious, loves nothing better than the sound of his own speeches. He'd sell his soul for higher office, and may already have mortgaged it. He has influence, Beresford. Dangerous influence, too sure of himself by half. The echo of the corridor seemed to deepen as Blackwood's voice dropped lower. And last, Miles. Under-Secretary Miles, nervous fellow, overlooked in every meeting. The sort who spills ink on his papers and apologizes for breathing. But do not mistake timidity for innocence. Some of the greatest leaks in history have sprung from the overlooked man who wished to matter. And Miles, I dare say, longs to matter. Tommy digested the names. 3 men, 3 possibilities, a gambler, a negotist, a desperate shadow. Any one of them could have been in Churchill's office that night. Blackwood's eyes glittered. Now you see the danger. Touch these names in the wrong way, and you'll bring down not one career, but half the cabinet. And in wartime that can fracture more than politics. "I understand," Tommy said quietly, "but something was stolen. If not from Churchill's own desk, then from within his walls." Harding saw it, and Harding may already be silenced. The Major's moustache twitched. "The clear I heard rumours. Found missing, was he?" Tommy nodded grimly, his room ransacked, signs of burnt papers. Blackwood swore under his breath a Saltus's oath, and stared hard down the corridor, as though the marble itself had ears. Then you are in waters blacker than you know. Be cautious, Beresford. Not everyone here is what they seem. Some smile as patriots while they trade secrets like playing cards. A group of clerks passed close, their arms piled high with dispatch boxes. Blackwood fell silent until they had gone, then said, "My advice, watch, listen, but tread light. If you stir too much, the hornet's nest will find you, and the sting may be fatal." Tommy absorbed this, his chest tight. Pride pricked him that he should be trusted with such whispers. But unease weighed heavier. He had wanted information. Now he had names that could topple governments. At that moment, the corridor seemed to press in on him. The footsteps, the rustle of files, the quiet urgency. He felt the machinery of a humming all around, vast and unstoppable. To meddle in its gears was peril indeed. Blackwood's hand clapped his shoulder, startling him. "Good man, Beresford. I knew you in the service. Steady head, straight aim. Don't lose that now. But remember discretion. And for heaven's sake, keep that wife of yours well clear." Tommy managed a tight smile. Keeping Tuppence clear is like keeping rain from falling. Blackwood gave a grunt that might have been amusement. Then at least keep her under an umbrella. With that he turned smartly and strode away, his boots ringing on the marble, his broad back soon swallowed by the tide of uniforms and files. Tommy stood a moment longer, letting the echo fade. Pride and unease battled within him. To be back in these halls stirred the soldier in him, the old sense of belonging to something vast. Yet now the stakes were darker. This was not glory or gallantry. It was suspicion and betrayal whispered behind locked doors. He set his hat firmly on his head and walked out into the drizzle of Whitehall once more. The rain had eased, but the sky hung low, a ceiling of grey pressing on the city. As he strode across the pavement, the names stole in his head like a grim litany. Reginald, Ainsworth, Miles, each a man of power, each a man with reason, and any one of them perhaps the traitor who had rifled Churchill's desk. The thought chilled him, and somewhere he knew Tuppence was following her own trail, equally perilous, among the whispers of servants and landladies. The war rumbled in distant skies, but here in the very heart of government, treason might be brewing, and Tommy Beresford, ordinary man turned reluctant spy, found himself once more at the centre of it. Bloomsbury, for all its bookish reputation, could be a most unromantic place by mid-morning. The pavement still held last night's damp. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke, and the terrace houses, with their peeling paint, seemed to sag beneath the weight of rationing. Yet Tuppence Beresford, brisk and bright in her sensible coat, walked into it with the air of a woman determined to ferret it out every last secret. She had sent Tommy off toward Whitehall with a kiss on the cheek, and the warning to keep his eyes open. Now alone she turned her own to the domestic stage of Harding's lodging-house. If truth hid anywhere, it was as likely in a whispered remark between cups of tears in some locked cabinet drawer. The landlord once more, her shawl knotted tighter than before. Her expression suggested she half regretted letting these strangers into her lodger's affairs. But Tuppence had a way with such women, part charm, part persistence, and part the aura of one who would not be turned away. "Good morning, Mrs. Crouch," the woman admitted reluctantly. "Mrs. Crouch," Tuppence repeated warmly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I thought perhaps we might talk a little more about Mr. Harding. Such a nice young man, and naturally when one hears of him gone off in such a rush, one worries." Mrs. Crouch's lips twitched, unsure whether to agree. Tuppence pressed on. "I've always found," she continued, "that in a house like this people notice things. Oh, nothing grand but little habits who comes and goes, who slams doors. I dare say you've noticed more than Mr. Harding thought." Mrs. Crouch hesitated, then gave a sigh. Well, he wasn't a bad lodger. Paid regular, quiet mostly. Only she trailed off. Only twopence prompted, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. The woman glanced up the stairs, lowered her voice. Only there was that visitor, a lady she was, came 2 or 3 times of an evening. Always after dark. Left a smell in the hallway. Perfume, strong stuff, foreignique. Tuppence's brows lifted. Indeed, a sweetheart, perhaps. Maybe Mrs. Crouch sniffed, but he never said, "I didn't pry." Still, she was no common girl. Well-dressed, fine gloves, walked like she owned the street. The image pricked Tuppence's imagination. A mysterious woman gliding through the shabby corridor, perfume marking her passage. It had the makings of scandal or worse. And did Mr. Harding ever speak of her? Mrs. Crouch shook her head, only muttered once to the maid that he had papers might change the war. I told him not to talk so grand. He laughed, said he only meant he had important work. But his eyes, she shivered. They looked frightened. Tuppence thanked her, pressing a half-crown into her hand despite protest. Money loosened tongues, and Mrs. Crouch, though hesitant, seemed a little lighter after. Upstairs. She coaxed the maid into a quiet corner. A thin girl, with reamed hands from endless scrubbing. She looked at Tuppence with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "You worked here long?" Tuppence asked kindly. "6 months, miss, since before Mr. Harding came. And you saw the lady visitor?" The maid nodded quickly. "Ois, always left her gloves smelling. Jasmine, maybe. Gave me a shilling once. Told me to keep the lamps lit. Pretty but sharp. Didn't smile." Tuppence filed it away. Perfume, gloves, money for silence. It sounded less like a sweetheart, and more like a conspirator. The maid fidgeted. "He said queer things sometimes, Mr. Harding did. Talked of secrets too heavy for one man's shoulders. Said he'd either be a hero or a ghost. I thought he was joking, but her voice faltered. But now he's gone." Tuppence finished softly. The girl nodded. And his room, the state of it, as if someone wanted every scrap burned. "I cleaned after, miss, but I didn't dare say a word." Tuppence let the girl return to her duties, then climbed the narrow staircase herself. Harding's room, though still in disarray, had been partly tidied. Yet Tuppence's eyes, sharp and curious, went straight to the places often overlooked. She tapped the skirting boards, lifted the mattress edge, poked behind the cheap wardrobe. It was under the bed, half lodged between a floorboard and the wall, that she found it, a scrap of newspaper, torn and foreign. She smoothed it against her knee. The print was not English, but Portuguese, the name Lisboa, visible in the masthead, and scrolled in pencil along the margin, and address. "Who Warfare House 12 midnight. Interesting," she murmured. "Very interesting indeed." She folded the scrap into her handbag, her mind already leaping. A foreign newspaper, a perfumed visitor, whispers of papers that could change the war. The pieces formed no picture yet, but the edges touched. Downstairs, she thanked Mrs. Crouch again, her manner cheerful, hiding the tight coil of excitement in her chest. She stepped out into the street, where the fog had thinned, but the blackout lamps still burned dully against the greyness. She had gone only a dozen paces when she felt it. A presence, the sound of footsteps falling too precisely behind her own, pausing when she paused, resuming when she resumed. She cast a sidelong glance into a shop window, catching a reflection in the glass. A man, tall, shoulders hunched, his hat brim low, his outline blurred by the mist, but unmistakably following. Tuppence quickened her pace, her heels clicking sharply. The rhythm behind her matched. She turned into a side street, narrow and dim, houses leaning close as though sharing secrets. She glanced back. The silhouette followed, unhurried, implacable. Her heart beat faster. But her mind remained steady. To run was to reveal fear. Instead, she stopped abruptly at the corner and bent to fuss with her shoe, as though adjusting a strap. When she looked up, the man had halted too, 20 paces back, pretending to study a lamppost as though it held the day's news. Not very subtle, she murmured. Straightening, she walked on, taking a longer route that looped through the square. The men followed still. Only when she approached a busier thoroughfare, with soldiers laughing outside a pub and women queuing for bread, did the silhouette finally melt away, swallowed by mist and crowd. Tuppence exhaled slowly. She drew her coat tighter and pressed on, her mind racing with possibilities. Who had sent them? The cabinet suspects Tommy had mentioned. The mysterious lady visitor. Or another hand entirely. One that had been watching since the letter first slid under their door. Whatever the answer, one truth was plain. Harding's secrets were not only his. She turned toward home, her heels brisk upon the pavement, determined to compare notes with Tommy. For in the fog-bound streets of London, someone was playing a game of pursuit and silence, and the Beresford had just been moved a dangerous step forward on the board. The rain had cleared by the time Tuppence reached their flat in South Kensington, but the city felt no lighter. A pall of greyness lay over the rooftops, the kind that made even laughter on the street sound subdued, as if London itself were waiting for bad news. Tommy was already there, sitting stiffly in his chair with the evening paper spread across his knees. The ink was still damp. A smudge stained the side of his hand, where he had pressed too eagerly to turn the page. His expression when he looked up stopped Tuppence at the door. "Well?" she asked quietly. He lifted the paper showing the headline in heavy type. "Clerk found in Tempame's police say accident." Her breath caught. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps, snatched the paper and read. The article was short, written with the grim brevity of wartime reporting. A man's body recovered near Blackfriars, identified by papers in his pocket as Andrew Harding, civil service clear. Police suggested he had slipped, perhaps drunk, into the river late at night. Foul play was not suspected. Tuppence let the paper fall into her lap. Accident. Her voice was sharp with disbelief. Harding, who shook like a leaf when he spoke of secrets stolen from Churchill's desk, who ran from a tea-room, convinced he was being followed. He conveniently stumbles into the Tempames. Tommy rubbed his forehead. "That's what the police say. They would," she retorted. "It's easier. A dead clerk who drowned is no story. But if a clerk was silenced because he knew too much, well, that is something altogether more alarming." She stood restless, pacing before the fire. The room was warm, the curtains drawn tight against the blackout, but the atmosphere seemed cold and oppressive. Tommy tried reason. Tuppence, perhaps he was afraid enough to drink, to stumble to despair. "We mustn't leap to murder when misfortune might suffice." "Misfortune doesn't ransack rooms," she snapped. "Misfortune doesn't burn papers in a grate, and misfortune doesn't leave half. A memorandum lying conveniently where we might find it." He said nothing, but the line of his jaw hardened. Tuppence stopped pacing and faced him squarely. "No, Tommy, this was not an accident." Harding was silenced. He had too much to say about Hammerfall, about papers that could change the war, about a woman who smelled of jasmine perfume. Someone feared he might talk, and now he never will. For a long moment, the clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a motorcar rumbled past, muffled by the blackout curtains. Finally, Tommy exhaled. "Very well. Let us assume murder. Then what? What do we truly have?" She sat opposite him, leaning forward. "We have fragments. The burnt paper with coded numbers. The perfume, foreign, strong, remembered by the maid. The foreign newspaper, Portuguese, found under his bed. And thanks to you, 3 cabinet names whispered in Whitehall. Sir Reginald, Lord Ainsworth, and Miles. Tommy nodded grimly, each with their own shadows. Reginald the Datter, Ainsworth the ambitious hawk, Miles the overlooked nervous fellow. Any of them might have reason, though none yet point directly to Harding's death. Unless, Tuppence said slowly, Harding saw one of them in Churchill's study. Possible, but still conjecture, she smiled faintly. Conjecture is where truth begins, darling. He gave her a wry look, and where danger begins, too. They fell silent again, each turning over the puzzle. The fire crackled softly. Thesity outside seemed muffled, its usual sounds swallowed by rationing and caution. Even laughter from the pub at the corner sounded like an echo from another world. At last Tommy spoke. There is something else. While you were charming landladies and maids, I asked about Harding among contacts. One hint surfaced. Nothing confirmed, but whispered, Harding had debts. Gambling debts, cards, they said. Some man in Soho pressing him for money. Tuppence frowned. That's convenient. Almost too convenient. A gambler can drown in the Thames without troubling Whitehall. Exactly. It could be a red herring, or it could be true. Perhaps Harding was in over his head in more ways than one. She tapped the paper still lying across her lap. Even if he owed half of Soho, he wouldn't invent a story about Churchill's desk. No, Tommy. The gambling may have been his weakness, but his death was about something larger. I'm sure of it. Tommy studied her. You're very certain. She met his gaze steadily. I trust instinct. And instinct tells me we've stepped into something far deeper than a drowned clerk. The clock chimed the half hour. Both started slightly, nervous-strung taut. Tommy rose, took the poker, and stirred the fire. Sparks leapt and died. Very well. We carry on carefully, quietly. But if Churchill's name is to be dragged into this, we keep it out, Tuppence finished for him. Until we must, until we know more. He nodded. Exactly. She stood and crossed to the sideboard, pouring 2 small glasses of cherry. She handed him one, raised her slightly. To Harding, she said softly. Tommy lifted his glass. To Harding. They drank, the gesture solemn. Then Tuppence set her glass aside, squared her shoulders, and said briskly, Now what next? We can't let fear write the rest of the story. But before Tommy could answer, a sharp sound cut through the room. The letterbox. Both froze. Tommy strode to the door, pulled it open, and looked down. On the mat lay an envelope, ivory-coloured, identical to the first. Its surface gleamed faintly in the dim hall light. He bent, picked it up, and brought it to the table. The flap was unsealed. He drew out the sheet inside and read aloud, Leave well enough alone. The words were stark, final. Tuppence felt the hairs on her arms rise. She met Tommy's eyes. So, she said softly, We're noticed. He folded the paper, his mouth grim, and warned. She smiled, but there was no mirth in it. Which means, darling, that we must be doing something right. The clock ticked, the fire hissed. Outside, the city brooded under its blackout, and in their hands lay a second warning, sharper, colder than the first. The game had begun in earnest. The invitation arrived the next morning, Wednesday, slid through their letterbox with all the formality of an errand boy in gloves. The envelope was heavy cream, the crest stamped in wax, the handwriting bold. Inside, engraved in looping black script with the words, Lord Ainsworth requests the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Beresford at dinner Thursday evening at his residence in Belgrave Square. Tommy frowned as he turned it in his hands. Well, this is either extraordinary luck, he said, or a trap. Tuppence smiled, taking the card from him. Darling, in our line of work, luck and traps are usually indistinguishable. But I'd hate to miss the chance of lobster à la Ainsworth, if such a thing still exists in rationed London. The evening found them dressed for the occasion, though dressed in wartime meant ingenuity as much as elegance. Tuppence wore a gown cleverly altered from an earlier season, her pearls polished to a warm glow, and her smile sharpened to social brilliance. Tommy in black tie carried himself with the stiff assurance of a man who had learned long ago to bluff through awkward situations with straight shoulders. Belgrave Square loomed impressive, even under blackout. The great houses stood tall and silent, windows shrouded in thick curtains, facades lit only by the glimmer of guarded lanterns. Ainsworth's townhouse blazed with a discreet but unmistakable welcome. Servants at the door, uniformed chauffeurs waiting in shadow, the faint hum of voices drifting out into the night. Inside, the atmosphere was glittering but tense, the sort of gathering where laughter skimmed the surface, while whispers curdled beneath. The chandeliers were dimmed in deference to the blackout, but they still scattered soft golden light over gilt mirrors and long tables dressed in white. Silver gleamed, crystal sparkled, and the scent of polish mingled with perfume and cigar smoke. Officers in uniform mingled with ministers in dinner jackets, their conversation sharp, eyes sharper still. Every word seemed weighed, every smile edged. "Wartime society," Tuppence murmured to Tommy as they handed over their coats. Half the city at war, the other half at dinner. They were introduced with polite murmurs, their presence apparently of no surprise. If anyone wondered why Lord Ainsworth had included a pair of less than prominent names, no one said so aloud. Lord Ainsworth himself soon appeared, a tall man with silver at his temples and the assured manner of one accustomed to authority. His voice carried easily above the chatter, his smile broad, his gaze calculating. He greeted Tuppence with gallant warmth, and Tommy with brisk cordiality. "Delighted you could join us. We keep our little gatherings when we can. A reminder, you know, that civilization hasn't quite been bombed to rubble." "Indeed," Tommy replied evenly. Dinner was announced, and they moved to the long table gleaming with glass and silver. The courses were modest by pre-war standards. Soup, fish, a careful roast, but dressed with elegance and served with wines that spoke of a host unwilling to forgo luxury. Tuppence played her part to perfection, slipping into the role of charming socialite with effortless ease. She laughed at a general's anecdote, complimented a minister's wife on her gown, and made admiring remarks about the wine. Yet all the while her ears were pricked, her mind alert. Tommy, quieter, observed. He noted the strained expressions, the quick glances when certain topics surfaced, the lowered voices whenever the words papers or Lisbon arose. It was near the end of the fish course that Tuppence caught the first significant whisper. Two men to her left leaned close, their words just audible between clinks of cutlery. "Missing papers," they said. "A leak. That's the story. Lisbon again. Always Lisbon." She smiled sweetly at her neighbour, as if discussing the weather, while her thoughts sharpened. Lisbon, the neutral city buzzing with spies, the clearing-house of Europe's secrets. If Harding scraps of memorandum had found their way there, the danger was immense. At the head of the table, Lord Ainsworth presided with practised ease. His conversation was polished, his anecdotes lightly barbed, his laughter full. Yet when pressed by a general about troop movements, by a minister about negotiations, his replies were evasive, his charm deflecting questions without yielding substance. Tuppence studied him from behind her smile. Magnetic, yes, but beneath the polish a shadow of calculation. After the roast came dessert, and with it the wines port, and curiously, a Portuguese vintage. The merchant who provided it was present, seated not far down the table. He was a broad man with a neatly trimmed beard, his accent rolling richly as he described vineyards and barrels. Too richly, Tuppence thought. His eyes strayed off into political conversation, too alert for a mere wine cellar. She leaned close to Tommy, murmuring, "Our Portuguese friend listens more than he drinks." Tommy gave a slight nod and looks more interested in cabinet leaks than corks. It was a red herring, perhaps, but an enticing one. As coffee was served, the guests drifted into smaller groups, Tuppence slipping easily from one knot of conversation to the next. Gathered fragments, complaints of rationing, hints of discontent, and always the undercurrent of fear about missing papers. She laughed, flattered, and filed every whisper away. Tommy, meanwhile, kept to the edge, noting who avoided whom, who lingered too long near the Portuguese merchant, who whispered with a little too much intensity. At length Tuppence excused herself from a dull exchange about bridge, and strolled lightly toward the side rooms. She had learned long ago that the best discoveries were made not at the table, but in the margins. The drawing room was empty, its fire burning low. Beyond a smaller library beckoned, the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, the air heavy with polish and paper. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The quiet was profound. Only thetic of a clock, and the faint echo of voices from the dining hall reached her. She moved among the books, running her fingers lightly along the spines. It was chance or instinct that made her pull down a slim volume of parliamentary debates. It fell open, and within its pages lay a folded sheet of paper, tucked neatly as though hidden in haste. Her breath caught. It was a memorandum, torn the other half of Harding's fragment. The jagged edge matched perfectly the piece she carried in her handbag. She unfolded it quickly. The words leapt out. Hammerfall. Deployment figures withheld until approval. Immediate risk if compromised. Her pulse quickened. Here was proof beyond question. The papers Harding had spoken of. The papers he had died for. Tucked carelessly or cunningly into a book in Aworth's library. She replaced the sheet quickly, heart racing, footsteps sounding faint in the corridor beyond. For a moment she stood in the dim library, the shadows pressing close, the weight of discovery heavy in her hands. Then she slipped back to the drawing room, smoothing her gown, arranging her expression into one of serene unconcern. She rejoined the party, as though she had been admiring the wallpaper. Tommy caught her eye across the room. She gave the faintest nod. The evening wore on, conversations turning lighter, laughter forced. But for Tommy and Tuppence, the glitter of chandeliers and the murmur of politics had faded into the background, for in their possession now was the other half of the secret, and with it the certainty that the game was darker than ever. The Beresfords' flat was quiet, but heavy with tension when they laid the two halves of the memorandum side by side on the table. The lamplight flickered across the torn edges, which fitted together with uncanny precision like bones of the same skeleton. Tommy leaned forward, smoothing the sheet flat with careful fingers. There it is, whole again, and dangerous enough to hang a man. The typewritten words were few but chilling. Operation Hammerfall. Deployment figures withheld until approval. Immediate risk if compromised. Tuppence read them aloud in a whisper, as though saying the name might summon listening ears. Hammerfall. It sounds like something from a Vanna opera. Or worse. It's real, Tommy said grimly. It must be, and if Harding died for it. He broke off, unwilling to finish the thought. She sat back studying him. Only a handful of people could know such details, you said. Exactly. Which means the traitor is close. Far closer than we like. The words hung in the room, heavy with implication. Outside, distant thunder rolled, not storm, but bombs. A faint echo from the east. London was quiet for the moment, but never truly silent. Tuppence tapped the page. 3 names. Sir Reginald with his debts, Lord Ainsworth with his ambition, Miles with his nerves, and yet she broke off, eyes narrowing, the Portuguese connection. That wine merchant was no mere seller of vintages. Perhaps, Tommy allowed, but our problem isn't Lisbon. It's here. He folded the sheet carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it into his pocket. This is proof of a leak, and proof that whoever stole it is willing to kill to cover their tracks. They stared at one another across the lamplit table. Blackwood Tuppence said suddenly he must know something more. "He warned you." "Yes, but warnings are as good as admissions." "We should press him." Tommy hesitated. "Blackwood is a soldier, not a politician. If he says we're out of our depth—" She leaned forward, eyes flashing. "Darling, when have we ever stayed in the shallow end?" It was decided. Before setting out, Tuppence had written a brief, careful note and dispatched it by messenger to Downing Street. Not an accusation, she had said, only a warning. It was signed simply Mrs. Beresford. They met Major Blackwood in a dim office at Whitehall, a room shuttered against daylight, the air stale with tobacco. The corridor outside buzzed with clerks and footsteps, but inside the hush was oppressive. Blackwood stood by the desk, hands clasped behind his back, moustache bristling like a line of bayonets. "You're reckless," he said flatly. "You should have burned that paper the moment you found it." Tommy matched his sternness and let the traitor walk free. "Harding died because of it." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "I told you before, 3 men have access, 3 possibilities. But to accuse without proof would destroy us. Operation Hammerfall is vital. If our enemies know even its name, the cost will be measured in blood." Tuppence spoke then, her voice calm but pointed. "And yet, Major, someone already knows, which means someone very high indeed has betrayed us. Sir Reginald's debts would make him pliable. Lord Ainsworth's ambition makes him dangerous. Miles, well, Miles seems too timid to risk it. But perhaps that's why no one looks at him twice." Blackwood's gaze flicked between them, sharp, measuring. "You speak lightly of treason, Mrs. Beresford. I speak of what I see," she replied. "And what I see is that Harding's death has been neatly explained away. His papers burned, his name dismissed. That's convenient for someone." The silence stretched thicker smoke. Finally, Blackwood said, "You're meddling where you shouldn't. Drop this for your own sake. The kind of men we're speaking of, they don't hesitate. If they think you're a threat, you'll end up like Harding, washed up on the riverbank with the word accident pinned to you." Tuppence lifted her chin. "I've never much cared for accidents." Tommy put a hand on hers, a subtle warning. He turned to Blackwood. "We can't simply walk away, not now. If Hammerfall is compromised, then it's already too late," Blackwood snapped. The outburst startled them both. Blackwood caught himself, exhaled heavily, and lowered his voice. "Forgive me. This business wears on a man. But hear me. You're in danger, both of you. If you care for your lives, leave it tonight." He moved to the door, signaling the meeting was over. The Beresfords had no choice but to leave. Outside the air was damp, the street slick with drizzle. A blackout warden barked at a motorist for showing too much headlamp. The world seemed narrowed, every shadow deeper, every footstep behind them suspect. Tuppence spoke first, her tone sharp. "Did you hear him? If it's already too late." "That wasn't caution. That was knowledge." Tommy frowned. "You think Blackwood knows more than he says?" "I think he knows everything," she replied. "And the question is whether he warns us because he's honest, or because he's guilty." They walked on in silence, each turning over the words. Back at the flat, the fire burned low. Tommy drew out the memorandum again, studying it under the lamplight. The words seemed to grow heavier with each reading. "Operation Hammerfall," he murmured. "What does it mean? An offensive, a counter-strike? Something big enough to shift the war," Tuppence said, "and small enough that its name is whispered only in locked rooms." He rubbed his temple. "We're running out of time. Should we go directly to Churchill?" Tuppence hesitated. The thought was tempting but fraught. And hand him half-formed suspicions, whispers, and a dead clerk. He'd dismiss us, or worse, we'd give ourselves away to the very man we seek. Then what? She met his gaze. "We watch, we listen, we press quietly. and we survive long enough to find the proof. The clock on the mantel chimed softly. Outside, distant bombs thudded muffled, but insistent like a heartbeat of war. Tommy rose, restless, pacing the room. Reginald with his debts, Miles with his nerves, Ainsworth with his ambition. Each could sell a secret. Each could pocket Lisbon's gold. And yet, Tuppence added, Blackwood's warning rings loudest. He stopped pacing, looked at her. You suspect him? I don't know, she admitted, but he plays his cards too close. And men who tell you to leave well enough alone usually mean the opposite. The knock came at midnight. Not a knock, but a sound and the rattle of a window, the faint creak of hinges. Tommy and Tuppence froze. Then Tommy moved swiftly, crossing the room, pulling open the bedroom door. The sight that met them chilled. Their flat had been ransacked. Papers scattered across the floor, drawers pulled out, cushions slashed. The tidy order of their small world torn apart with ruthless hands. On the wall above the desk, pinned with a drawing pin, was a sheet of paper typed in stark black letters. Last warning. Tuppence's hand flew to her handbag. The Portuguese clipping was still there. The penciled words, Wapping Wharf Warehouse, 12 midnight, suddenly less like a curiosity, and more like an appointment someone very much wanted them to miss. The silence roared in their ears. Tuppence stepped closer, reading the words again, though they needed no repetition. So she whispered, The net tightens indeed. Tommy's jaw set, and we're caught in the middle. The fire hissed. The clock ticked. Outside the city waited in shadow. And in the Beresford's shattered flat, the game had shifted once more. From whispers to threats, from suspicion to open peril, London's fog could be a blessing or a curse. That night, as Tommy and Tuppence picked their way down toward the docks, it seemed determined to be both. The air hung thick, rolling in from the river like a living thing, swallowing the lamps until each glowed faintly, a smudge in the murk. Horns blared from ships hidden in the mist, long mournful notes that reverberated across the water like warnings. The lead had come from the foreign newspaper fragment Tuppence had discovered under Harding's bed. A Portuguese edition with marginalia in pencil, an address scrolled in haste. It pointed them here to the warehouses along whose smugglers had done business for centuries, and where tonight something darker seemed to await. They moved side by side, their footsteps muffled on the wet cobbles. Crates were stacked along the dock, looming like tombstones, their stenkled words blurred by damp. The river sloshed unseen beyond, its black waters licking against the pilings. Tuppence tightened her coat against the chill. Picturesque, isn't it? If picturesque means cold, damp, and likely fatal. Tommy gave a grim smile. We need answers. If this contact exists, they may be our only link between Harding and Lisbon. She stopped listening. Somewhere in the fog, a footstep echoed, not theirs. A pause, then another. They exchanged a glance. Friend or foe? Tuppence whispered. Only one way to find out. They pressed on, hearts thudding. At the appointed warehouse they found the door ajar. Inside the gloom was deeper still. Dripping water plinked from a roof beam, echoing in the cavernous space. Wooden crates formed narrow aisles, their shadows stretching like grasping arms. Hello, Tommy called softly. We were told to meet. No answer. Only the groan of the river and the faint scratch of a rat. Tuppence's voice was tight. I don't like this. Nor do I, he admitted, but we've come too far. They advanced between the crates. The smell of salt and damp wood was overwhelming. Then movement. A shadow slid across the far wall, too swift to be illusion. Someone's here, Tuppence breathed. The next moment the warehouse erupted with sound. Heavy footsteps, the slam of a door, the rush of figures through the fog. Run, Tommy shouted. They darted between crates as footsteps thundered behind them. The fog within the warehouse seemed to swirl thicker, stirred by motion, cloaking and revealing by turns. A figure loomed suddenly before them, blocking their path. The man swung a length of pipe. Tommy ducked, the blow glancing against a crate with a splintering crack. He shoved the man aside, dragging Tuppence with him. They fled down a side aisle, the pursuit closing in. Another shadow lunged. Tuppence lashed out with her handbag, striking the assailant's face with a satisfying thud. He reeled back, cursing as they raced past. Through a broken door, they burst into the open air. The fog outside was thicker still, clinging, suffocating. The roar of the rival was closer, the horns blaring louder. They ran along the dock, the planks slick beneath their shoes. Behind them came the shouts of pursuit. Tommy pulled Tuppence into a narrow passage between warehouses. They crouched, panting, listening to the footsteps thunder past. For a moment there was silence. Then another sound, slow, deliberate. A single man approaching, his tread steady, his silhouette emerging through the fog. Tuppence gripped Tommy's arm. "Look!" The figure stepped into the dim glow of a distant lamp. Tall, broad-shouldered, moustache bristling, Major Blackwood. Tommy's breath caught. It's him. Blackwood stopped a few yards away, the fog curling around him like a cloak. His eyes gleamed coldly. So he said, his voice low but carrying. "You couldn't leave well enough alone." Tuppence's voice was sharp. "Harding's death, the warnings, the ransacked flat. It was you." Blackwood's moustache twitched almost in amusement. "You think you're clever, Mrs. Beresford. You've stumbled on truths bigger than you understand. Yes, I pass papers abroad to Lisbon. Do you know why? Because war is a game of balance. Information is currency, and those who control its flow control the future." Tommy's fists clenched. "You betrayed your country." Blackwood's gaze was unflinching. "I did what was necessary. Britain is not as invincible as Churchill claims. A man must secure his place for the aftermath. When the war ends, and it will, those who traded wisely will rule the ashes." Tuppence felt a chill deeper than the fog. His words rang with conviction, not madness. "And Harding," she demanded. "A nuisance," Blackwood said coldly. He saw what he shouldn't. He fancied himself a patriot. "I warned him. He didn't listen. Accidents happen in the Tempemes." The fog muffled everything but his words. Cruel and calm, Tommy stepped forward. "You'll hang for this." Blackwood's hand moved too fast. A pistol gleamed briefly in the lamplight. "On the contrary," he said, "you'll vanish. A pair of unfortunate meddlers who strayed where they shouldn't. The war swallows many lives. 2 more won't be noticed." Tuppence's mind raced. In her handbag was nothing but lipstick, gloves, and the heavy presence of instinct. She shifted slightly, her eyes scanning him. The fog, the shadows. But salvation came from elsewhere. A horn blared startlingly close. And in that instant a figure stumbled in the fog behind Blackwood. One of his men calling something in Portuguese. Blackwood turned his head for a heartbeat. "Now," Tuppence hissed. They darted past crates, sprinting toward the riverside. Shouts erupted. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past into the mist. They ran blind, the fog thick, the ground slick with spray. Warehouses loomed and vanished. Their footsteps echoed wildly, mingling with those of their pursuers. A dead end loomed, the dock itself, the black river heaving below. They skidded to a halt. Behind them, footsteps closed in. "We're trapped," Tommy muttered. Tuppence's eyes darted. "Not yet," she pointed. Along the warehouse wall ran a narrow wooden ledge, barely wide enough to walk, leading toward another alley. "Ladies first," Tommy asked grimly. "Cowards first," she retorted and pushed him on. They edged along, the river sucking hungrily below. Boards creaked, nails groaned. Another shot cracked the night, splinters flying from the wall beside them. Then a crash. From above, a rope coil tumbled, striking the planks. Tommy snatched it instinctively. As he did, the shadow of Blackwood loomed again, his pistol raised. Tuppence acted without thought. She lunged forward, striking his arm with the handbag. The pistol fired wild, the shot vanishing into the fog. In the scuffle, his pocket spilled, a small leather diary tumbling to the dock. Tuppence seized it. "Run!" They bolted down the alley, the diary clutched tight in her hand. Shouts pursued, but the fog grew thicker, the sounds confused. Footsteps split, some chasing shadows, others losing track entirely. At last, gasping, they emerged into a wider street where a patrol of constables was passing. Their whistles shrilled as they spotted the commotion. Blackwood's men melted back into the fog. Tommy and Tuppence did not stop running until they reached the safety of a crowded tram stop. Their lungs burning, their hands still clasped. Only then did they pause, leaning against the cold iron post, breathless, shaken, alive. Tuppence opened her hand. The diary lay there, scuffed but intact. Tommy stared at it. "Blackwood's, his diary," she whispered. "If it holds what I think, names, contacts, proof, then we have him." They looked at each other, the fog swirling about them, the horns still echoing across the river. The danger was greater than ever, but so too was the hope. Blackwood was no longer suspicion. He was fact, and they had the key to bringing him down. The night was iron grey, London wrapped tight in blackout. Her streets hushed, except for the occasional rumble of a distant lorry. The Beresfords moved like shadows across Whitehall, their footsteps muted on the wet pavement. The air was cold, sharp with smoke from half-burnt coal, and the faint boom of anti-aircraft guns throbbed like a faraway heartbeat. Inside Tuppence's handbag, the folded fragments of the memorandum rustled with ominous weight. Beside it lay the other prize, Blackwood's pocket diary, its cover scuffed, its pages crammed with coded notations and names they did not yet dare to read. Proof enough if handled carefully. Proof of betrayal at the very heart of power. But proof was only useful if delivered to the right hands. And tonight they intended to make certain those hands were Churchill's himself. The plan was both reckless and absurd. To slip into Whitehall under cover of night, restore the memorandum to the Prime Minister's desk, and wait for the traitor to betray himself. Reckless, yes, but it was the kind of recklessness that suited Tommy and Tuppence, and that had carried them through many a tight corner before. As they approached the looming facade of the government buildings, Tuppence whispered, "Darling, do remind me, do we intend to survive this?" Tommy squeezed her hand. "If luck's with us, and if not, at least we'll go down, irritating the enemy, which is no small satisfaction." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glittered with nerves. Very gallant, very foolish. The main entrance was, of course, impossible, but Tommy had done his reconnaissance. A side door, seldom used, offered a chance. Its lock wassled. The skeleton key in his pocket, borrowed from a sympathetic clerk, clicked softly as he turned it. The door creaked open, spilling a draught of stale air. They moved along the same corridor Tommy had walked in daylight, now emptied to a hush. Inside, Whitehall at night was another world. Corridors stretched long and echoing, lit only by the dull glow of shaded lamps. The marble floors gleamed faintly, every step threatening betrayal. The air smelled of polish and damp wool, mingled with the faint tang of tobacco that seemed woven into the very stones. They moved cautiously, hugging shadows, their ears straining. Somewhere a guard coughed. Somewhere else the click of boots echoed receding. Tuppence whispered, "It's like sneaking through a cathedral." "Worshippers of paperwork," Tommy murmured back. "Silence or be struck down by memos." Her laugh was a breath swiftly smothered. They passed door after door, each brass plaque glinting faintly. Foreign Office, War Department, Cabinet Secretariat. Finally, the corridor narrowed, and at its end loomed the oak door, broad and solemn with a polished brass plate. Prime Minister. Tommy's heart thudded. He reached for the handle and froze. From the far end of the corridor, footsteps approached. They darted into an alcove, breath held as the glow of a lantern wavered closer. A guard passed, his boots clicking, his keys jangling. He paused, coughed, then moved on, the sound fading into silence. Only when the hush returned did Tommy ease forward. He tested the door, locked of course. He produced the second skeleton key. A soft scrape, a twist, and the latch yielded. The heavy door swung inward with a whisper of hinges. The Prime Minister's study was as formidable as its master. A vast desk dominated the centre, its surface scattered with papers, blot and inkstand. Books lined the shelves, maps covered the walls, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and brandy. A clock ticked on the mantel, steady as a heartbeat. They slipped inside and closed the door. Tommy crossed to the desk, his movements careful. He drew out the memorandum, fitted its halves together, and placed it squarely in the centre of the blotter. There it lay, innocuous in appearance, yet heavy with consequence. Tuppence adjusted a lamp so that the sheet lay illuminated as if daring discovery. She turned to Tommy. Now we wait. They found cover behind a tall filing cabinet, shadows cloaking them. Minutes ticked by, each one stretched to as wire. The building was hushed, save for the muffled boom of distant guns. Then the sound, a key in the lock. The door eased open. A figure slipped inside, moving with practice of stealth. A man in uniform, tall, broad-shouldered, moustache bristling. Blackwood. He crossed swiftly to the desk, his step unerring. From his pocket he drew a key, not to the door, but to the desk itself. He unlocked a drawer, slid it open, and began rifling. His movements were calm, efficient, the actions of a man who had done this before. Then his eyes lit on the memorandum. He froze, then reached. Tuppence stepped out of the shadows. Looking for this major? Blackwood spun, his face hardening. Tommy stepped out beside her, caught in the act. For a moment the room crackled with silence. Then Blackwood's lip curled. Fools! You've trapped yourselves as neatly as me. Do you imagine anyone will believe you? A soldier decorated, trusted, against two busybodies who creep into Whitehall at night? He straightened, his voice rising with calculated outrage. Guards! No footsteps answered. The corridor had been cleared minutes earlier on Churchill's own orders. He sneered. So, you think to accuse me, and when Churchill returns, you'll present this farce? No, you'll be the ones accused. Foreign spies caught planting false papers. I'll see you shot before dawn. Tuppence's chin lifted. A neat performance, Major. But perhaps you underestimate our foresight. Her words had barely left her lips when the door opened again. Light spilled in, and with it a presence. Winston Churchill himself entered, his stout figure framed in the doorway, a cigar clamped between his fingers, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. Behind him came two security officers, revolvers ready. The Prime Minister's gaze swept the room. Took in the tableau, Blackwood at the desk, the Beresfords facing him, the memorandum gleaming in the lamplight. Well, Churchill said dryly, this looks lively. Blackwood recovered instantly, snapping to attention. Prime Minister, thank God you've come. I discovered these intruders tampering with your desk. Foreign spies, no doubt. Aye enough. Churchill's voice cracked like a whip. He stepped forward, stubbed his cigar in the ashtray, and fixed Blackwood with a stare that seemed to burn through to the marrow. Major Blackwood, I received a most interesting letter yesterday. A cautious letter from a Mrs. Beresford, whom I happen to know has been of use to this country before. Her words advised vigilance. Her words suggested a rat among the cheese. Tuppence inclined her head slightly, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Churchill continued, So I waited. I watched. And tonight I arranged to be summoned at the opportune moment. He gestured. Which seems to be now. Blackwood's face drained of colour. Tommy stepped forward. We found Harding's torn memorandum. We found your diary. We saw you pass information to Lisbon. The diary was produced, laid on the desk beside the memorandum. Churchill flipped it open, scanned the coded entries, his brows knitting. Then he closed it with a snap. Damning, he said softly. Most damning. Blackwood's eyes darted to the guards, to the door, to the window. Desperation flickered. He lunged for the pistol at his belt, but the guards were quicker. One barked, "Stand down!" Another thrust the barrel of his revolver squarely at Blackwood's chest. For a moment, the room teetered on violence. Then Blackwood exhaled, slow, defeated. His shoulders slumped. The pistol clattered to the floor. Churchill regarded him a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Take him." The guards seized him, marched him from the room. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading into silence. Churchill turned back to the Beresfords, his eyes, fierce and weary, softened slightly. "Well done, damned well done. You've plucked a thorn from the lion's paw." Tuppence allowed herself a small smile. "We try to be useful," Tommy added, "though we'd prefer fewer ambushes in warehouses, if it can be arranged." Churchill chuckled, a rumble like distant thunder. "Danger is part of the trade, my dears, but you've shown courage, wit, and patriotism, for that the country owes you thanks." He took up the memorandum, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket. "Hammerfall remains secure, and the traitor will face justice." The clock ticked on, steady, implacable. Outside bombs might still fall, but within these walls, for the moment, order had been restored. Churchill relit his cigar, puffed once, and nodded toward the door. "Go home, rest. The war will be waiting in the morning, but tonight you may sleep knowing you've done your part." Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a look. Hand in hand they turned and left the study, the weight of danger lifting at last. As they stepped into the cool night air, the first pale streaks of dawn crept over London's rooftops. The city, battered but unbowed, stirred to life once more, and the Beresfords, weary yet triumphant, walked into the new day, their hearts lightened by victory, and by the knowledge that once again they had stood in the shadows and held the line. The fire crackled softly in the grate, its glow painting the walls of the Beresford sitting room in shades of amber. Outside London, Carridon with its muffled rhythms, trams rattling distantly, a milk cart clattering over cobblestones, the occasional echo of boots on the pavement. But here, within the snug cocoon of their flat, peace had settled at last. Tuppence sat curled in her chair, legs tucked neatly beneath her, ate a cup warming her hands. Beside her, on the low table, rested a modest plate of rationed biscuits, their corners chipped, their sweetness a faint memory of better days. Across from her, Tommy leaned back with an air of well-earned weariness, steam curling from his own cup. "Well," Tuppence said at last, "we've earned a quiet night. Tomorrow will make its own demands." Tommy gave a dry smile, a polite way of describing it. "Some people go to the cinema for excitement. We prefer Whitehall break-ins and midnight fog chases." She raised a brow. "Don't forget the dinner party. Perfectly dreadful roast, though the Portuguese wine wasn't half bad." "Trust you," he said, "to recall the menu, even while uncovering treason." Here he's twinkled. "One must pay attention to details. That's how mysteries unravel in the roast beef as much as in the memoranda." They shared a smile, the kind that belonged only to those who had faced danger together and emerged intact. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady and reassuring. Tuppence's gaze drifted toward the flames. "Poor Harding," her voice softened. "He never stood a chance, did he?" trying to be brave, but caught between giants, and all for a scrap of paper he thought might change the war. Tommy stirred his tea thoughtfully. He'd change it in his way. Without him, we'd never have known to look. He paid the price, but he tipped the scales. They fell quiet, honouring the clerk's memory in the hush. At length Tuppence spoke again, her tone sharper, and to think it was Blackwood all along. I liked him in a way. That firm moustache, that air of confidence. He seemed so liable. Tommy nodded grimly. Betrayal usually does. It wears the face you trust, the voice you heed. That's why it works, which is why it must have been so bitter for Churchill, Tuppence mused. To see one of his own officers unmasked, I almost pied him for a moment. Tommy gave a low chuckle. He didn't show pity, he showed steel. I wouldn't want to be Blackwood, not when Churchill's glare is fixed upon him. She sipped her tea, savouring the warmth. No, though I suppose Blackwood wouldn't care for our sympathy either. He believed in his own cleverness right to the end. That's the danger with men like him. They mistake cunning for wisdom. Still, Tommy said, reaching for a biscuit, I imagine the gallows will sort his philosophy from his practice. Tuppence winced. So morbid, Tommy. So accurate, he replied, crunching the biscuit. A knock at the door interrupted them. The post. Tuppence rose, smoothing her skirt, and returned a moment later with a single envelope. Cream paper, discreet seal, the handwriting bold. She opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she read. Well, she said slowly, we've had thank-you notes from neighbours for watering their geraniums, and once from Aunt Mary for rescuing her peckies from the river, but this is rather different. She handed it to Tommy. The note was brief, the penmanship forceful. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, your recent services, though unofficial, have not gone unnoticed. England has many defenders. Few work so cheerfully in shadows. For your discretion, you will have my gratitude. For your courage, my respect. Do not imagine I shall forget either. W. Churchill. P.S. If ever the business of biscuits improves after this war, you shall have a tin from my own cupboard. Tommy read it twice, a slow grin spreading. Well, that's something for the mantelpiece. Tuppence beamed. A note from Churchill himself. And with wit, too, promising biscuits no less. That's a reward worth more than medals. Tommy folded the letter carefully and placed it on the mantel beside the clock. Proof, if we ever doubted it, that this country still values common sense and cheek. They sank back into their chairs, the fire crackling. For a time they let silence return, companionable and warm. At last Tuppence stirred. You realise, of course, that we can't expect a quiet life again. Not really. Danger follows us like an old friend. It always has. From the day we took our first job to every muddle since it turns up on our doorstep. Tommy looked into the fire, then at her. His eyes softened. Yes, but at least it makes life more interesting. She laughed softly, the sound bright in the dim room. Interesting. That's one word for it. The clock chimed the hour. Outside, the city carried on, weary, determined, unbroken. Within their small flat, the Beresfords sat together, hand in hand, now warmed by fire tea and the peculiar satisfaction of a mystery untangled. And if tomorrow brought another envelope, another knock, another plunge into intrigue, well, so be it. They were ready, for this was Tommy and Tuppence's way to take tea after storms, to laugh after peril, to walk into danger together side by side, always side by side.